name is Bobby Douglas, and I am the Executive Director of OneEighty. And I just had the pleasure of someone coming up to me and said, did you used to be a Norwalk trucker? Now, how many people of you knew that the Norwalk, Ohio, our mascot was the truckers? I think it does go down as the most unique mascot ever, and not many people would know that. So it's a pleasure to see someone from my hometown here today. OneEighty, just briefly to give you a quick overview, we are a nonprofit organization that helps people deal with addiction and other substance use disorders. We offer outpatient and residential treatment. We just started last week, I guess, with a partial hospitalization program. We have a medical department that offers medication-assisted treatment for people who are struggling particularly with opiate addiction, but others as well. And we also have we offer peer recovery services, which is where people who have had life experience dealing with substance use issues actually actively work with other folks trying to help them as they establish themselves in recovery. We also provide services to deal with the issues of domestic violence and sexual assault. We help people who are homeless and need housing, and then we're also very dedicated to community education and prevention. So that's just a brief overview of who we are. We'd like to thank Wooster City Schools for letting us host this evening, and also the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, the Mental Health and Recovery Board, and the United Way of Wayne and Holmes counties. So we're actually able to fund this series of educational programs we're doing through a thing that's called the State Opiate Response Funds. And when you hear about on the news about the federal government trying to put significant dollars out to fight opiate addiction, that's what's funding this evening. A few things for housekeeping. We ask that you keep your mask on. Bathrooms are out the door and to the right. We will have questions and answers after Dr. Labor's presentation. And we do have a Facebook Live feed going on right now that you'll be able to watch later, or if you want to direct somebody to it, we would appreciate that. There are also several tables out front that have different kinds of resources from OneEighty, from the Circle Prevention Coalition, and also the Wayne County Health Department. They actually have Narcan kits out there that if you want to carry one in your purse or your pocket or in your car or whatever, or keep one in your home if you have somebody you're concerned about at risk of overdosing, that's available. You know, a story I think about often is a few years ago I was out trying to raise money for our new women's residential treatment center, and I was meeting with a potential donor who told me he thought they needed to stop using Narcan and just let people deal with the consequences of what happened when they overdosed. And when I said to him, I looked at him, I said, would you feel the same way if that were your child? And he kind of didn't answer. But not less than a year later, he's calling me because they found out his child had an addiction to opiates. So we were able to refer into treatment, and that young man is in recovery at this point. But also his dad has become a huge fan of Dr. Labor, who you're going to hear speak tonight, to the point of purchasing her books, handing them out to every probation officer, anybody in the criminal justice he sees, because he felt like it was such a good explanation of what addiction is and how we need to be dealing with it. And I think if you haven't heard Dr. Labor before, you'll have that same experience. Today, August 31st, is recognized as National Overdose Awareness Day. It was sad for me this week to see several people I know who have lost their children to overdose on Facebook, putting up memories of their child and not wanting people to forget them. So that's what we're thinking about today. Our local health department indicates that in 2021 through July 31st, we've had 167 overdose emergency room visits. Last year in 2020, we had 311 emergency room visits. Both of those are lower than historical averages, and I'm suspecting much of that is due to three things. One is, I think we've got a lot of education out there for people about opiates. I think also, unfortunately, many people have moved now from opiate addiction and use to methamphetamine. But I also think Narcan has played a role in saving people's lives, and that's ultimately what we're about. Through this year so far, we've had 13 Wayne County residents die from overdose, and last year we had 34 die from overdose, which is, I think, about one every week and a half, and that's higher than our historical average. Some of these numbers suggest that we as a county are improving our prevention efforts. However, one death is too many, and national numbers are very different right now. They indicate that drug overdoses are up by 30% in 2020, and obviously the pandemic has something to do with that. Also want to mention that September, kind of is 2 months, I don't want to say that we celebrate, but that we acknowledge issues. September is Suicide Awareness Month. And suicide and overdose deaths are closely related as traumatic losses. Some choose overdose as a mean to die from suicide, so we don't always know whether the death was intentional or not. This year we've had 10 suicide deaths in Wayne County, and last year we had 14 folks die from suicide. September is also Recovery Month, and that's where the hope comes in. We believe that recovery is possible, and we celebrate those in recovery. I have shared this story a couple times, but I was going through McDonald's the other day, and I had my OneEighty mask on, and a young man at the window said, "Do you work at OneEighty?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I'm living in one of your sober living programs." And I went through Pathway, and I'm 14 months clean. And that's the kind of thing that can just really make your whole day. I saw him again today, and he made sure he was speaking to me and still working directing traffic at McDonald's today. This is part one of a three-part series. September 5th, we're going to be having probably a virtual event, most likely, on recovery, and we're really fortunate that we have a number of our past clients working for us as recovery coaches or peer recovery workers. And they're going to be talking about what recovery is all about. And on September 30th, we're going to be having a panel dealing with the issue of prevention, because ultimately that's where it's all at. So, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nicole Labor. She is our medical director, and we're very, very proud to say that. She's developed quite a following, particularly in Northeast Ohio, but beyond that as well. She's worked with OneEighty for over 10 years. She's also the director of Addiction Medicine Fellowship Program for SUMA Hospitals and the medical director for Interval Brotherhood Home and Esper Treatment Center in Erie, Pennsylvania. So you can see she keeps pretty busy in her spare time. She spends time educating healthcare professionals, churches, schools, and community members about the disease of addiction, and works very hard to remove the stigma surrounding addiction. And I honestly feel like we've made great strides in people understanding what addiction is due to her efforts here locally. She's also published a best-selling book and a companion workbook called The Addictaholic Deconstructed. And I'm assuming we have some here, if you want to pick one of those up on the way out. And it's a great read, I would say, so I encourage you to do that. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce my co-worker and compadre, Dr. Nicole Labor.
Thanks for being here. And for those of you that have seen me talk already, you've certainly seen this presentation, but hopefully there's some tidbit you've forgotten and you'll relearn or learn something new. But this is the general presentation that I give when people ask me to educate about addiction. Those are my credentials, nobody cares. Okay, so the reason that I do this particular talk is because we call addiction a disease. We talk about it as a disease, we bill for it as a disease, but nobody ever describes why it's a disease. We know that diabetes is a disease because there's the pancreas doesn't work and then there's no insulin, and so they can't get sugar in the cells, and so people have all kinds of problems. It's a disease. We know cancer is a disease because we get tumors and then stuff stops working, and so, I mean, when we're diagnosed with a disease, when a loved one is diagnosed with a disease, we're given some sort of explanation, hopefully, of a good physician. And so we know why. But when it comes to addiction, nobody wants to talk about or explain why it's a disease, and that's because most of them don't know. We don't get a whole lot of education as physicians. But the problem is this: I can call it a disease all day, and you can believe me, but when I say to people, how many of you really believe in your heart that addiction is similar, at least in scope, to, say, cancer, right? Most people don't feel that way. Most people have a gut feeling like, no, I mean, I get it, I feel bad, but it's not the same, right? Because they always sort of imagine this choice element that's going along with addiction that doesn't go with cancer. And so the idea is really to give a broad picture of what the disease process is so that we can have compassion, right? And I know we don't, because I know that there are people with diabetes who make the choice to eat a piece of chocolate cake, get behind the wheel of a car, knowing that they can have a seizure while they're driving and kill somebody. But nobody feels bad for their, everybody feels bad for their kids, right? If that happens, oh, that poor kids, they lost their parent or whatever. But if someone makes the choice to use drugs or alcohol, get behind the wheel of a car, cause an accident, they're all going, well, the world's probably better off without them, right? There's always people in the peanut gallery with that kind of opinion, and that speaks a lot to how we feel about addiction. The other piece is this opioid situation. I understand that today is Overdose Awareness Day, and I want to sort of bring light to the fact that overdose, for me, from my standpoint, is not just opioid overdose. When you take opioids in large amounts, your breathing stops because the drug tells the brain stem to slow down the breathing, and it stops breathing to the point where the person can't get oxygen to the brain, they die, okay? That's what an opioid overdose is. But if you take too much methamphetamine, your heart speeds up so much, you have a heart attack, you have a stroke, okay? If you take too much you drink too much alcohol, you can have alcohol poisoning, right? These are all overdoses. These are not the ones we're counting in the numbers when we're talking about nationwide and local overdoses. We're talking just about one drug, right? And in my world, they're all the same. And that's kind of the point of this whole presentation, is that a drug is a drug, and people die from using drugs. So the idea behind this epidemic and is sort of it's not new. It's been around for all times. And what I always, the example I always use is, this is like that whack-a-mole game where you pop one down and another one pops up. Like we keep focusing on one specific drug, and then another one pops up. And what we need to focus on collectively is how do we unplug that game? How do we stop the machine, right? That's the disease of addiction. It's not the specific mole that pops up, right? So, and I think anybody who's seen my lectures on, say, YouTube, for example, because people record them and then they post them on there. I think if you find one from like 3 or 4 years ago, I believe I stood up and said, mark my words, in a couple of years when we have enough opioid task forces and meetings and conferences about opiates and opiate overdoses, we're going to see a rise in methamphetamine. And that's exactly what we're seeing now, right? Because addiction has nothing to do with a specific drug. But just, as an example, I just like to go through the history briefly so that people get a grasp. Like, opiates have been around forever. They come from the poppy plant. Morphine is a direct derivative from the plant, so anyone that likes the it's only a plant argument, I just want to point out that codeine and morphine are really only a plant. We had a large epidemic of opiate use in the early 1800s, where women mostly were prescribed opiates, morphine specifically, because anytime a woman had like a thought, she was hysterical and put in like a home or something, and so they would just give her morphine to shut her up. But then they started having problems, obviously, with that. In the 1900s, early 1900s, Bayer Pharmaceutical Company created heroin, and they marketed it as a I don't know if they marketed it as a non-addictive pain reliever, but they marketed it, and it was good for everything, right? Because opiates are good for everything. They're good for pain, anxiety, social anxiety, awkwardness, right? All kinds of stuff. So that was on the market for a while, but then they took it off because it caused problems. We saw a rise in illicit heroin in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but it primarily affected minority populations, so we didn't pay attention to it like we should have. In the 80s, we had the cocaine epidemic. People that were around then probably remember there was a large rise in pregnant women having miscarriages due to crack cocaine use, and it was declared an emergency, a nationwide emergency. Then in the early 2000s, we had the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act of 2005. People were making methamphetamine in their sheds in the backyard and blowing themselves up. And so we're like, oh, we better solve this meth problem, so we're gonna make Sudafed only available if you have a driver's license. And now you can't get cold medicine unless you have a driver's license. That's how we solved the methamphetamine problem of 2005. Then 2011, bath salts. You could buy them at the truck stop, you could buy them at the head shop. They were called different things, but primarily they were bath salts, and they were sort of a hallucinogenic to some degree, but there's also some stimulant properties. It was the zombie apocalypse, people were eating people's faces, there was all kinds of crazy stuff happening, so we made them illegal. You can't buy them at the truck stop anymore, right? And then what did we see? The rise of the opiates. And now we're seeing the rise of the methamphetamine, but it's no longer people building it in their backyard sheds. It's coming up from South America, and it's causing huge amounts of psychosis and all kinds of mental illness in people, just because it's made from so much garbage. So the point is, the disease is the problem, not the drug. So in the world of medicine, in order for something to qualify as a disease, it needs to meet certain criteria. It's not that difficult to meet, okay? But essentially, you have an organ or an organ system, you have a defect in that organ or organ system, and then you have symptoms because of it. That's it. So in the case of diabetes type 1, the organ is the pancreas. There's a decrease in beta islet cells, so there's not enough of these insulin-producing cells, so you don't have enough insulin. That's the defect. And then the symptoms are simply that you have elevated blood sugar, which can lead to eye disease, kidney disease, nerve disease. In the case of a broken leg, is considered an acute disease process. If I break my leg, the organ is the bone, right, the femur bone. The defect is the fracture. Symptoms are pain, screaming, bleeding, deformity, whatever, right? So the question becomes, how do we fit addiction into this model so that it really is the same as any other disease process? So to start, it's a brain disease. So we're at a bit of a disadvantage because we don't really understand the brain very well. Nobody really understands the brain very well. Not even the brain specialists. But what we do know is that every single thing that we do, think, feel, every emotion we have, every thought we have, every behavior, every action we take comes from electrical and chemical activity in the brain. So that means a defect in the brain can cause a symptom that affects any of those things, including thoughts, emotions, behaviors, physical activity, okay? So the two parts of the brain that I think everybody that cares about addiction at all needs to understand are the midbrain and the cortex, the frontal cortex specifically, but the cortex. So the midbrain is the part of the brain that is, it's really deep, it's very primitive. I often call it the tiger brain. You have no control over it. It is completely subconscious. It is our life or death processing station. So our midbrain is active when our lives are in danger, either individually or collectively, okay? So the midbrain will turn on in times when our life is in jeopardy, and it will reach for the most recent or most appropriate experience or education it has in order to keep us alive in that moment. That's all it does. It doesn't like weigh pros and cons or make a list of like, well, maybe I should. So like a bear approaches you in the woods, some of you are gonna just lay down and play dead. Some of you are gonna scream and run away. Some of you are gonna try and fight the bear, okay? That is a direct response to your life experience and what your brain, your midbrain, comes up with as the best solution in that moment to save your life, okay? So it's not thinking about long-term consequences. So the three main functions of the midbrain are to eat nutrients and drink water, to run away from or fight predators, and to procreate for perpetuation of the species. So when a baby is first born, we feed it. And the reason that we feed it is because nutrients and food will activate the dopamine reward system, which is located in the midbrain. So we activate the reward system, which essentially trains the midbrain to believe that nutrients, food, are necessary for survival. So that baby will then crave or desire food when it's hungry, because the brain says, oh, we're gonna die if we don't eat. And so then the baby will cry for food. So the reward system is necessary for life, but just like a lot of other diseases, these normal processes, when they get wacky, no longer function correctly, that's when we start to see disease. So the frontal cortex, the other part of the brain that I talk about, is really, I call it the superhero brain, because it's really where all our superpowers are. So the frontal cortex is located where it sounds like in the front of your head, and it is responsible for you, your personality, everything about your ethics, morals, values, willpower, choice, your ability to know right from wrong, your ability to fall in love, spirituality, everything about you consciously is located in the frontal cortex, okay? Every skill that you have is located to some degree in the frontal cortex. So you may have the ability to do something physically well, like play a sport, and that activity, the physical activity, is a different area of the brain. But the ability to take that physical activity and integrate it into playing that sport, teamwork, knowing certain plays, knowing what the rules are, all of that gets linked through the frontal cortex. So the frontal cortex is largely responsible for many of our skill sets to be functional. Drugs work in the midbrain. They don't work in the cortex. We thought forever and ever that it was a moral disease and therefore it would have to be in the cortex. But what we found is that by stimulating mice brains, who don't have a frontal cortex, they don't have morals and ethics, we can stimulate their cortex all day long and they have no desire to continue. But if you stimulate their midbrain, they will continue to seek out that stimulation over and over and over until they die. So if you put a little probe in a little mouse brain and you put it in their front or their midbrain, and you allow them to hit a lever and give their midbrain a little jolt of happiness, okay? They will continue to hit that lever over and over. They won't eat, they won't drink, they won't play with the other mice. They're just gonna hit that lever until they die, right? Which is very similar to what we see in human people with addiction, is that they will continue to use a substance despite the fact that it is contrary to their core value system. They know what's right and wrong. They know their family is the most important. They know they have to go to work to pay their bills. They know all that. But yet they will continue to use substances knowing that they will potentially lose all of those things. And that's what we see in mice. But mice, don't have bad parents or come from bad homes, and mice aren't they were probably abused if they were having this experiment done, but mice don't have a frontal cortex, is the point. And so it's not a moral failing. It's not that mice just don't know any better, okay? Because there is no knowing better for mice. So what happens in addiction is that with repeated use of a substance, of highly rewarding substances, or on the flip side of that, with trauma, because a similar process happens with trauma, the brain gets rewired, right? And it gets rewired in such a way that it believes highly rewarding substances are necessary for survival in the same way that food and nutrients and water and running away from a bear is necessary for survival. Okay, so it is incorrect. It's not a correct belief, but the brain is wired to believe that that's the case. So the example I always use that people are probably really sick of, but I can't really think of a better one, is that if you are literally dying of thirst, you're in the desert, day 5, no water, organ systems are shutting down, you are not going to survive another 24 hours unless you get some water, and I come over and I hand you a bottle of water and I tell you, if you drink this water, I'm going to take your kids and your house and your spouse and your job and bank account. There is not a person on earth who's biologically designed to be able to refuse my water. Because in that moment, when you are literally dying, the midbrain is active and the frontal cortex is inactive. So the midbrain is going, we gotta have water, we gotta have water, we gotta have water. And the frontal cortex is just asleep. And the frontal cortex is where we value our kids and our job and our bank account and all those things. Okay? So you take the water, you drink the water, you would satiate that tiger, that midbrain will go to sleep. Your frontal cortex comes back online and you go, oh shit, I just gave up all that stuff for water. And then you're gonna try and manipulate me into giving you your stuff back, right? Until the next time the craving comes up for water, and then you probably give up more. So that's the way it works in a person with addiction's brain, over and over and over and over throughout the day, when they don't have the highly rewarding substance that the brain is craving. So, and I always like to sort of throw this caveat in here. I want people to really understand this. There is a difference between having the disease of addiction and abusing drugs and alcohol. And when just for the record, when I say drugs, I'm including alcohol in that bundle, because they're all exactly the same to the brain, which I'm going to explain. So, but people can use and abuse drugs for a long time. They can do it and have consequences. And then they can stop and just not use anymore. They did not have the disease of addiction. Okay? By definition, people who have the disease of addiction cannot just stop, not without help. All right? So it is entirely possible to use drugs for a long time. And I always say there's a guy, everybody knows one of them, Uncle Marty, comes to Thanksgiving. I used cocaine, crystal meth, or whatever, every day for 10 years, and my life was so crazy and chaotic, and then I just, time to grow up, and I put it down, and you just gotta be strong and have willpower, and you can stop, right? Everybody knows that guy. And he makes it really difficult, because that's really what everybody wants, right? That's what we all want, just stop using. But somebody with the disease of addiction is unable to do so because of the rewiring of their brain, right? But the person like Uncle Marty has not had the brain rewired, right? And the reason we know is because he's able to just stop, okay? Now, I put this stoplight up here, which I'm going to come back to later, but I want people to sort of understand this. Willpower is like a frontal cortex function. Willpower is located in our frontal cortex. And the way willpower works is like this. If I am at a red light, my foot is on the brake. Willpower keeps me from driving through the red light. I'm physically capable of driving through a red light, but willpower says, don't do it. Don't do it. You don't have permission. You're going to hurt yourself or somebody else and screw up the flow of traffic and all kinds of stuff. So willpower says, no, I will not go, and it keeps my foot on the brake. But as soon as that light turns green, I have permission to go through that light. And willpower is rendered useless. I have the same amount of willpower as I did 2 seconds ago when that light was red. But I don't need it when I have permission to go through the intersection, okay? So I'll come back to that. But let's talk about Uncle Marty. Let's talk about what happens if I put him in a brain scanner and I put someone who truly has addiction in the brain scanner. What are we going to see? We're going to see 2 different areas of the brain light up when we show them their drug of choice or a picture of their drug of choice. Now, to be fair, this can change at any time. So Uncle Marty may have stopped using the day before his brain would have changed, right, to become true addiction. So I can put him in a brain scanner today and he'll say, haha, see, I don't have addiction, I can just use drugs because I can stop whenever I want. And then tomorrow he uses one last time, it triggers the gene cascade, which turns on the genes in his brain, which triggers the brain cells, et cetera, and he becomes addicted. So tomorrow he is addicted. So my point is, it's useless to do scans on people just to find out if they're truly have addiction or they have they just abuse drugs. But there is a difference. So assuming that because one person was able to do so, not everybody can. That's the whole point of that story. Okay. So, and again, these are just kind of illustrations of what you would expect to see if you put somebody in a brain scanner. And on the right side, I guess pointy. Okay, so on your right side, that's a brain that has addiction. The left side is a brain that's essentially not addicted. And you can see the darker areas around the outside, that's the cortex. And there's less activity in the cortex of an individual who has substance use disorder when they are shown their drug of choice or in the presence of their drug of choice. There's less cortex activity. And remember, the cortex is where our good decision making happens. Here is an actual functional MRI of the midbrain. So the areas that's lighted up in there, the green and the red, that's the midbrain. And you see on the addicted side, the addicted brain, there's less red. And what that means is there are fewer dopamine receptors, right? Which probably doesn't mean very much to you right now, but soon you'll be an expert. The important part of this slide, though, that I want people to get is that it doesn't seem to matter what the drug of choice was. Cocaine, meth, alcohol, heroin, benzos, even marijuana would show the exact same thing. The brain doesn't know the difference in terms of where addiction happens from one drug to the next. Okay, so basically, addiction is a broken pleasure sense. It is a broken reward system. All right, so this is how our brains work, simplified times a billion. We have trillions of brain cells in our heads. And those brain cells are all little factories, and they're all making neurotransmitters. And their neurotransmitters are just little chemicals. And they're things like serotonin and dopamine and epinephrine and acetylcholine and GABA and glutamine, okay? And the brain's making these little neurotransmitters and it's storing them in little vesicles inside the brain cells. When we receive stimulation, whether it is electrical or chemical stimulation from the environment, the brain will then, that stimulation will then cause the brain cell to release neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters will then go find their own receptors and have an effect. So, here's your example. I am walking across the stage. I see this ridge in the stage. So electrical signal would be sight, sound, touch, smell, taste, right? Electrical things. So I see, so electrically I receive a signal through my eyeballs that goes and tells my brain cells, oh, hey, there's something there. So that brain cell dumps out a bunch of neurotransmitter. That neurotransmitter, probably acetylcholine, will swim around and find the brain cells in my leg to stimulate movement. And the acetylcholine will bind to its receptor and it will say, take a step. And then I would take a step. Again, simplified times a billion. There's like 1 million brain cells involved in that process, but that's essentially what's happening. And so really what it comes down to is it doesn't matter what the original stimulation was. What matters is what the neurotransmitter was, because that's what's causing all the effect, right? So chemical signals, chemical stimulation are things like food, drink, medications, and drugs. Anything that we put into our bodies. Electrical stimulation are the things that we experience in our environment. Doesn't matter what the originating stimulation is, because that brain cell that it stimulates is going to dump a bunch of neurotransmitter, which is then going to go find its brain cell that it needs to find and cause an effect. So, this is where people really struggle with understanding this concept of addiction versus specific drugs. If I use something like heroin, I will ingest the heroin in some way, right? Doesn't matter how. It gets into my brain and it stimulates my brain cell to release a whole bunch of different neurotransmitters, okay? Some of them are gonna go to my frontal cortex and they're gonna cause a conscious experience. They're gonna cause me to be like, oh, I feel so relaxed, or oh, I feel so like not anxious, or for some people, oh, I have so much energy, I feel great, right? So they're gonna have a conscious experience with that. But there's also a bunch of neurotransmitters that are released that are going to go to the brainstem. And they're going to tell the brainstem, slow down the breathing, slow down the heart rate, right? That's subconscious. That's happening subconscious. You don't feel that happening. Then there's a bunch of neurotransmitters that are floating around doing all kinds of pain. Let's go find the pain sources. We're going to fix the pain problem, right? Because opiates do that. But then there's a bunch of neurotransmitter that gets released called dopamine. And the dopamine goes into the midbrain, the reward center. And it stimulates that reward center and goes, oh yeah, this is good. We should do this again. Like this, okay? That, remember, the midbrain is subconscious. So that experience of I like this happens at a subconscious level in the midbrain, not on the conscious level. Which means if someone uses heroin, opiate, say your dentist gave you Percocet or something and you took it, you did not like the way you felt. Made you nauseous, made you itchy, made your nose itch, made you feel sleepy, groggy. You don't like that feeling. So your conscious experience of neurotransmitters in the frontal cortex was bad, you don't like that. But subconsciously, your reward center did like that because it's impossible for this subconscious brain to not like dopamine. That's what it's designed to do. Now let's say I use alcohol. Same thing. Alcohol is going to get into my brain, bind to a bunch of receptors. There's going to be all kinds of stuff released. Some of it's going to go to my frontal cortex and be like, hey, you're a really good dancer. Hey, you should totally call that guy, right? And some of it's going to go to my cerebellum and tell me, you're not a good dancer. You can't even move your feet, right? And I'm going to fall down. So there's all kinds of stuff going on with these neurotransmitters. But when I drink alcohol, there's a bunch of dopamine that gets released and goes to my midbrain and says, yep, I like it. Marijuana, same thing. Benzodiazepines, which would be your Xans and Pams, right? So your Xanax, Valium, Ativan, Klonopin, Alprazolam, Midazolam, all those, okay? Same thing. Cocaine, methamphetamine. So they all work in the same way. The conscious experience of those drugs is different for everyone. Some people love to smoke pot because it relaxes them and helps their pain. Others don't like it because it makes them paranoid. But every brain likes the THC because it releases dopamine into the reward center. And the reward center, remember that the brain itself is making these neurotransmitters, not the drugs, right? So the dopamine that gets into my reward center when I use heroin is the exact same dopamine that gets into my reward center when I drink alcohol. It's exactly the same dopamine. So we have 10 perceptual systems in our brains. 1 through 5, everybody knows. 6 through 9 are for people that like physics. And then 10 is pleasure. We need pleasure to live. The human construct cannot survive without pleasure. We would not have survived as a species if reproducing was not at least in some way pleasurable. We would not get out of bed and function, go to work, interact with each other if there was not some sort of pleasure associated with those things. Okay? So we need pleasure. Ask anybody that has clinical depression, which is a totally different ballgame than what I'm talking about, but let's just go there for a second. Someone with clinical depression, right, when they're in the midst of depression, they don't experience pleasure. Ask them if they feel normal. You do not feel normal if you cannot experience pleasure. It's not possible. So we need pleasure to feel normal. Dopamine is our pleasure chemical. Dopamine is the driving chemical that forces us to seek out pleasurable experiences, okay? So dopamine is the thing that says, yes, this is better than I thought. We should do this again, okay? And dopamine is the neurotransmitter produced by our own brains, and it is released in very, very large amounts when we use addictive substances. So we have a threshold, right? Humans have a threshold in their brain for pleasure. So let's say I have to release, and again, just simplifying, 10 molecules of dopamine in order for me to experience pleasure. So I have this threshold that says 10 molecules of dopamine have to be released in order for my brain to consciously then start to realize that this is pleasurable and subconsciously go, this is pleasurable, okay? So anytime I do anything that releases or causes the release of 10 or more molecules of dopamine, I'm going to want to continue to do that. If it's less, I'm not going to want to continue to do it. So there are some things, and there's kind of universals, right? Most people are around, just like your body temperatures are pretty close. Most everybody's around 97.6 or whatever, unless you're using those head temperatures when you walk in the building in the winter, and then you're all at 92, right? Everybody was 92 degrees this winter. So we're all around 97.6, but there's variation. There's individual variation. Same with this, right? But it's around the same. So we're going to need that same 10 molecules of dopamine over and over to feel that this is an enjoyable experience. Some things are universal. Falling in love, having a child, getting a promotion, winning the lottery, right? Some of these things are really just universal. Everyone is going to get enough dopamine from that experience to sort of go, yeah, okay, I want to do that again. And then there are individual differences, which is why you have different hobbies than your friends or relatives, which is why some people continue to play instruments, and some people like to play sports, and some people are really good at art because they keep practicing it, because they get enjoyment from it, because they release enough dopamine from that activity to cross their threshold. Okay? So those are all natural activities. When I use drugs, when anyone uses drugs, addictive drugs, the reason they're addicted is because they cause a release of dopamine far greater than anything natural. Okay? So it causes this huge spike in dopamine, which of course is crossing the threshold. So subconsciously in the midbrain, everyone's brain likes all the addictive drugs. Well, what happens is when our brains are flooded with dopamine spikes, right? So, because again, this is not a steady, it's not like a steady state, because we would just get used to that, right? It actually spikes and spikes, because every time you use that substance, it spikes. So what happens is when the brain is continually flooded with this dopamine, it goes, all right, hold on. Originally, we have all these dopamine receptors hanging out, waiting for dopamine, because we want to have a good time. We want to be happy. So the dopamine receptors are all sitting around like, where's the dopamine? When's it coming? Right? And then they grab it when it comes. Well, when you keep flooding the area, the brain goes, look, it's taking too much energy to keep all these receptors around. We don't need them. Dopamine just keeps flooding this area. So the brain starts taking away dopamine receptors. But now if you have fewer dopamine receptors, they're farther and farther away from each other. You need more dopamine just to saturate the correct number of receptors to feel good. So basically, what happens is you need more dopamine to feel a normal amount of pleasure. So the threshold moves up. Your threshold for pleasure moves up. So now, playing that instrument or sport or doing whatever you did no longer crosses that threshold, no longer says, oh yeah, I want to do this again, which is why anybody who knows it, someone with addiction, they used to love something. He used to love to play his guitar, she used to love running, they used to love all kinds of, and they don't love it anymore. But that's because biologically they're not getting enough dopamine to cross their new threshold, right? So the only thing that crosses that threshold enough to make them feel normal is substances. And again, it can be any of the addictive substances, and this is where we start to run into the problem. Because when the brain is craving or desiring to feel normal and get enough dopamine to cross that threshold, it will preferentially seek out the specific drug that caused this problem. But if you can't get it for whatever reason, it will seek out any drug that it remembers dumping dopamine into the area. So the other neurotransmitter I talk about is glutamate. Right? Glutamate's really important in this process because glutamate is the most abundant neurotransmitter in the brain, and it is the executive assistant to dopamine. So every time dopamine is released, glutamate is right there going, let me write that down. Okay, this was an awesome event, let me write that down. And so glutamate, being very, it's like a Ivy League educated executive assistant, very smart, going to note all of the things around the dopamine release as well. So, oh, okay, oxycodone, awesome. Glutamate's right, let me write down. Oxycodone comes in this orange bottle. Orange bottles are awesome. Pharmacies are awesome. The house on 1st and 3rd is awesome. This room, this sheet, this person, whatever is awesome, right? Because glutamate, throw me a little file that explains why the dopamine was so good, okay? So glutamate is really important because this is why somebody, say they're abstinent from substances for 3 months, they're doing well, they feel well, and they roll into the Circle K to buy some milk, and they run into the guy that they used to use with in the house on 1st and 3rd, right? And they're like, oh, and maybe they're strong enough in their recovery program to be like, oh, I'm not gonna talk to that guy, and they go home. Well, for the next 2 weeks, one of two things is gonna happen. They're either gonna beef up their recovery efforts, so they're gonna call people that matter and talk, hey, I saw so-and-so, freaked me out, made me want to use, or they're going to keep it in their head, like, I'm going to fight through this because I'm tough and I'm going to stay clean, and they're going to become restless and irritable and discontent and not know what to do with themselves until finally they're like, you know what, I can go now. And they go to the store and they buy something to drink because you know what, alcohol wasn't really my drug, so it's not a big deal. And the brain gets its blast of dopamine and then it's game on. Right? The brain's super, okay, good, we're good, that's what I wanted, dopamine. You can keep doing that one, but you know what, next week when your dog dies, this alcohol isn't going to be enough anymore, right? We're going to need something stronger. So I do mention at the beginning, and I think that it's important to know, the study of addiction and the study of trauma go hand in hand. They actually are, I don't even think they study one without the other anymore. And partly because there's a process that happens with trauma that is almost identical to addiction. And that is that if someone experiences chronic and severe stress, which is essentially trauma, no matter what it is in life, childhood, adulthood, whatever, if you experience chronic and severe stress, your body, not everybody, again, these are always genetic things, but your body produces a hormone called corticotropin releasing factor, CRF. And when you have really high levels of CRF circulating in your brain and your body, your brain responds by taking away dopamine receptors in the midbrain, which is the same thing that happens in addiction if you were listening 10 seconds ago, right? Same exact process. And the reason for it is complicated and it's evolutionary, and it has to do with the fact that when you're traumatized, the brain wants you to seek out a safety solution, so it takes away the dopamine receptor, so you need more dopamine to seek out the pleasure. It's irrelevant for our purposes because it's a dysfunctional system, just like our stress system right now is dysfunctional, right? And we have evolved faster than these mechanisms have. So when someone has this problem, so let's take a person who experiences trauma as a child, for example, and now they have fewer dopamine receptors, so they need more dopamine to feel normal, to get pleasure, and then they're 12 years old and someone hands them a beer or a joint or something, they use it, the brain gets that blast of dopamine, and they go, this is what I've been, maybe not consciously even, because a lot of them, they'll tell you the first time I didn't like it, right? But subconsciously, that reward center goes, yes, I feel normal, finally. And then they will continue to seek out that feeling, and they will continue to seek out any substance that will give them that feeling. And now, the substances are running the show, and now they have to use to feel normal. And now the threshold keeps moving up, and now they have fewer dopamine receptors. And now, finding and using money and drugs to sustain this habit becomes chronically and severely stressful in and of itself. So now we have created our own self-sustaining trauma cycle, right? Because having active addiction is traumatic in and of itself. So, and it goes the other way too. Some people just start using the substance, and this is where the choice argument really gets under my skin, is because with the exception of very few religious groups, I don't know anyone who's never chosen to have a drink of alcohol, ever, right? I know they exist, but I don't know them. So anyone who's made a choice to have one alcoholic beverage, unless you have a genetic profile of your own genome your own chromosomes. You have no idea if one drink was all it was going to take for you to become alcoholic. So everyone made that choice, right? Everyone made the choice to use that first one. For some, it was the first one that triggered the gene to turn on to make the dopamine receptors go away. For some, it was the third. For some, it was the 20th. For some, it's the 1,000th. For some, it's going to take 1 million and they're never going to get there, right? But you don't know your gene profile. And so anyone that uses is making the choice to potentially becoming addicted at any time, right? So let's say that happens. There's someone's in college, oh, I'm just hanging out with my friends and we're drinking on the weekends, but I have a gene for addiction that's triggered by alcohol, and I don't know that. And so after, sophomore year, drinking every weekend, I turn that gene on. Well, now I start losing some of my dopamine receptors, right? So I'm not enjoying things as much as I used to, so now I'm drinking a little bit more. And I'm not just drinking to celebrate that finals are over or anything, I'm drinking just to drink because I'm sophisticated now that I'm a sophomore in college, right? And so I'm gonna drink, and now I need to keep drinking, so now I'm spending all of my money, I'm missing classes, I'm creating a stressful environment for myself to continue, and I'm hungover all the time, and so forth, and so that becomes traumatic. Right? So it doesn't matter if the trauma was first or the addiction was first. They go hand in hand and they create this very negative feedback loop. So stress or trauma essentially does the same thing as addiction, right? It increases the threshold for pleasure to a place where only highly rewarding substances will make it feel better or normal. So basically, addiction is a stress-induced pleasure deafness. It's the inability to experience pleasure like they used to, or like other normal people. So, in order for someone to have the disease of addiction, in order for someone to have the disease of anything, you have to have a gene for it, okay? You have to have some genetic predisposition for it. Not every gene that you have is turned on or triggered. Anybody here who has parents with different eye colors can tell you that, right? Because you generally got one or the other, and in some cases, neither. You got your grandparents, right? But you still have those genes, right? They're just not turned on. So whatever gene got turned on is the color of eyes that you got, or hair, or whatever, right? So in order to have a disease, you either have to have the gene for it, or you have to have a mutation for it, right? So we know in certain genes, if it's mutated a certain way, you are very likely to get breast cancer. But if you don't have any of those genes, mutations, you are probably never going to get breast cancer, right? If you don't have any of the gene mutations for lung cancer, you'll never get lung cancer, even if you smoke 1 million packs of cigarettes a day. If that doesn't mutate your gene, you're never gonna get lung cancer, at least not the smoking kind, right? So addiction is the same thing. You have to have a gene for addiction. 60% of all people have at least one, okay? It can go back 12 generations. You have no idea. So just because your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents or any of your aunts and uncles, nobody's ever had a problem, does not mean that you don't have the gene or the gene isn't in your family line. It just means you haven't seen it, okay? So 60% of all people have at least one, and there are lots of people that have more than one, okay? And genetics is a very complicated subject, and so in my attempts to simplify it, I try to explain it like this. So if you have a gene and it's got to be triggered or turned on, there's no way for you to know, again, unless you can read genetic profiles, which I don't even know if they can get down to this level, but it has to be turned on. So let's say in the case of Uncle Marty, let's say he used methamphetamine every day for 10 years. He put it down, he walked away, he never used it again. He said, I use willpower and all. So he doesn't have real addiction, or a true addiction. He goes on to become a productive member of society, he gets married, he has children, he's the councilman for his town, he has a good job, everything's going well for 8 or 9 years. He doesn't touch any drugs or anything because he doesn't need to, life's great, he's happy, whatever, right? So then he gets into a skiing accident, he injures his knee, he gets surgery, he gets prescribed oxycodone. Unbeknownst to him, his addiction gene is turned on by opiates. So he didn't know that, so he's taking his opiates, and You know, and he says, oh, I'm not worried about this because I used meth for all those years. I'm not an addict. I don't have an addictive personality. I don't have an addictive personality. I used meth all those years. So it's not a big deal. So 2 days after surgery, his pain level is here, and the amount of oxycodone he's getting is here. So he's fine, just taking care of his pain. But after 3 days, the inflammation starts to go away, and the level of pain is here. But the amount of oxycodone he's getting is still here. Because they don't change the dose, you just keep taking the same amount. So now that difference, that space, that's euphoria. That's the conscious experience of, yeah, okay, yes, I like this. I have energy now. I feel good. My anxiety is relieved. I feel motivated to do something. I want to clean my garage. I don't know. And now this guy is, you know, well-liked, member of society. So he calls his doctor, hey, I'm on those pills, I'm still having a lot of pain in my knee. And the doctor says, oh, you're a good guy. I'll call you in some more. So he gets more pain meds, and then of course he runs out early, and then the surgeon figures it out. He says, I'm not giving you any more. And then he's buying from his neighbors, then he's buying them on the street, and he can't afford them on the street anymore, so he's like, oh, I'll just buy some heroin. So then he winds up in the detox unit, needing to be detoxed from opiates. And I say, okay, I'm going to detox you from opiates, but you really can't use any other substance because they're all listening to your brain now. You've done the damage, and so now you can't. He says, oh, you don't get it. You don't know me. You don't know my body, doc. I used meth every day for 10 years. And I put it down, locked away, and didn't use for 9 years, so that's not a problem for me. And then a year later, he's back, and I'm detoxing him off of meth and heroin and alcohol and whatever else he decided to use. Because again, once the gene is turned on, all substances become problematic, even ones that were not problematic in the past. So relapse in humans is caused by 3 things. Dopamine release, okay? So dopamine release generally occurs in one of 2 ways, most commonly. So number 1, healthcare. Doctors don't know anything about addiction. Well, they're learning some because I tell them. But for the most part, they don't get a whole ton of education, right? So they don't get this. And they'll make the same mistakes that well-intentioned family members and other people will, and they'll say things like, oh, well, you were addicted to heroin, so it's okay for you to have Xanax for your anxiety. Or, oh, well, you were addicted to alcohol, so it's okay for you to have this oxycodone for your gout or whatever, right? Without realizing that for someone with true addiction, it doesn't matter that it's prescribed for a specific thing or that it's not their drug of choice, it will potentially lead to problems. If not that drug itself, back to the drug of choice, right? It's just the way it works, just the way it works. Family members are the other area where we see dopamine exposure, right? Well-intentioned. Oh, well, we told him we were going to kick him out if he kept smoking crack in the basement, so now he just uses marijuana, so it's okay, right? You've been clean from crack for the last 6 months. You can have a glass of champagne at your cousin's wedding or whatever, right? They mean well. It's not intended to be harmful, but without understanding that, you know, that 1 glass of champagne could potentially lead to a relapse because the brain doesn't know the difference, you know, that's where we see a lot of the dopamine exposure. The other thing that causes relapse is stress. Anybody that knows anybody that's ever had a relapse, you ask what happened, it was something stressful, right? And for people with addiction, boredom, lack of structure, is very stressful. And then the third thing is people, places, and things, right? I can't tell you how many times we have people in treatment and we say, listen, you gotta find new friends. You can't, even your relationships sometimes are not going to be healthy. They're too toxic because they're tied. The glutamate has tied that relationship, friendship, work environment to your drug use. So your glutamate is like, oh yeah, that job is awesome. But it's awesome because you know that you can get high on that loading dock, right? So people, places, and things, exposure to them cause relapse. So the midbrain, it feels like it needs these high-level dopamine agents in order to survive, right? That's what's basically happening. It's broken, it's incorrect, but that's what it believes. That's what the rewiring of the dopamine system amounts to, is that, oh, I need this high-level dopamine to live, right? So how does it take these individuals that we know come from good homes or know the difference between right and wrong, and cause them to make these decisions that we see them making, which would violate those core values. And the answer is craving. So craving is this activation of the reward system. Okay, so this is you in the desert, day 5, no water, right? Your cortex is shut down. All of your right and wrong and values and things that you care about are quiet and sleeping because this tiger's awake and angry and like, I need to feel different. We're gonna die, right? That's the overwhelming, obsessive need to change the way you feel in this moment. That's what craving is. And that is what true suffering is. Because you cannot make it go away. It will pass. About 10 seconds, 20 seconds, generally, it'll come right back for someone in active addiction. But most cravings pass within a few minutes, or with use of a substance. But for someone actively using or in early recovery, it comes right back, okay? So what happens is that when in those moments where the frontal cortex is asleep and the midbrain is awake, the midbrain is kind of like, remember I said it relies on your most recent or experiential life process to figure out whether you run away from the bear or lie down and play dead or whatever. It just looks through the files to find what makes the most sense. Well, while this is happening, the midbrain is going through the files looking for the reason to continue to use. So it's craving, it's awake, and it's going, I need a reason to be able to get what I need, right? I have to convince this frontal cortex that thinks it knows it all to let me go and use. And so it goes through the files, and it goes through the files which contain everything about you, whoever, right? And it's looking for things like, oh yeah, remember we have this chronic pain issue, yeah, that's the important thing. Or, oh hey, remember we have this horrible social anxiety, we don't even like to leave the house, remember that? Or, oh, my wife, my boss, whoever, they suck, my life sucks, whatever. It's looking for some reason. When that craving passes and the frontal cortex turns back on, even if it's brief, whatever the reason is that was found, that experience, that answer, that solution, will be staring you or that person in the face, right? And they go, you know what? I am the primary breadwinner for this family. I have to support my family. I can't support my family if I can't work, and I can't work if I can't sleep. I need Ambien, Xanax, alcohol, something to help me sleep. But I'm not doing it to get high. I'm doing it because I'm trying to be a responsible member of society and I can't work if I can't sleep, right? So essentially, the addict gives themselves permission. They find the permission, they find that green light. And so willpower, which is very, very helpful in keeping people from not using substances when they truly, truly believe they shouldn't and they can't, they're gonna hurt people, they don't use. But as soon as they have permission, the willpower is useless, right? It becomes useless. And so now they have permission. And once there's permission, now the brain has to compensate, right? Because even though I have permission to use because I have to sleep, because I have to work, because I have to support my family, I also know that I have to now lie to my employer, to my wife, to my children, to my whoever, and I have to lie to my doctor to get it, and I have to do all kinds of things that violate my core value system in order to support this. And so now I'm going to be doing a bunch of things that violate that core value system. So I lie and manipulate or steal or whatever, justify, rationalize, right? All day long, rationalization. And this is what we see. As a society, this is what we see. And this is not the whole picture, right? We didn't see all of the brain wonkiness that led up to this, right? That intense craving, that suffering, that desire, that need to have high-level dopamine. We don't see any of that. What we see is these shady behaviors. And this is not an attempt to say, okay, well, we should just let people get away with being, manipulative and lying and stealing because they have addiction. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. I think everyone should have consequences for their actions. But I think that it's important to understand the why. Why are they doing it? It's not because they're just bad people. It's because they have a really bad disease that tells them they have to do this. So the other piece of addiction that I think that we kind of neglect is the whole other part of the brain, the frontal cortex, right? So what's happening in the frontal cortex? Well, I said that the frontal cortex is where all of our skill sets are, right? So here's how skills work. When you're learning a new skill, you're walking through the woods and you create a footpath. And over time, the more you practice that skill, the wider and wider that path becomes. And the better you get, the wider it gets. And eventually, say you pick up the guitar, practice, practice, practice. Now it's a 1-lane highway, now it's a 2-lane highway, now it's a 4. And by the time you're ready to play the guitar at Carnegie Hall, it's a 16-lane highway with traffic in both directions through your cortex. That's the skill set that gets wired up and built, the infrastructure that's there. And you can play at Carnegie Hall because you've practiced the shit out of that guitar, right? You're ready. And then after you put down the guitar, you don't play. Well, all we do is hang up a piece of police tape and we close off the road. We don't do anything else. And over time, it breaks down. The infrastructure breaks down, you get some potholes, maybe the road's not as safe as it once was, but if you pick the guitar back up 10 years, 20 years later, you're still gonna be better at it than anybody else, right? Because you have that pathwork, that infrastructure, that framework for roads already there. So when we're learning a new skill, or trying to reignite an old skill, right? We're laying down the pathway, and that requires practice. We have to practice any skill we want to be good at. Coping skills are skills, right? Stress rewarding skills are skills, and we have to practice them in order to be good at them. The human brain is defaulted for ease, simplicity, convenience, right? We are a society of people who like convenience, ease, whatever's the easiest thing, that's what I want to do. The brain is designed such that when it needs to cope with something stressful, it is going to reach for the coping skill that is the easiest, most accessible, and quickest to get where it wants to be. So if I am using a substance that's highly rewarding and pleasurable, that will always be what my brain is going to reach for as the coping skill, unless I stop using those substances and spend my time and energy practicing the behavioral coping skills. Picking up the phone, calling people in recovery, going to counseling, being in groups, hanging out with, not isolating, not hanging out with people that are actively using, right? Those are skills. And they require practice, and they require practice when we don't need them, because if you wait to practice until the night before you're supposed to perform Carnegie Hall, you are going to be terrible, right? So the same thing, if you don't practice the coping skills until the day before you need them, or at the moment you need them, you're going to reach for the most convenient and the most accessible and the quickest acting one, which is going to be the substance. So this is a really fascinating piece of addiction, right? And this is what I think really helps sort of seal the deal for me that this isn't about the drugs, right? It's about the dopamine. Because what happens, and the glutamine, because what happens is that while glutamate is sort of keeping up these files about what gives us pleasure, it's also remembering the behaviors around getting the dopamine, as well as the easy, quick, accessible things. So, for example, instant gratification. When I use a drug, I get instant gratification. I instantly feel better, different, changed, whatever. I'm instantly removed from wherever I was, right, in my headspace. So the glutamate starts to keep a file that instant gratification is associated with pleasure. And so the brain of someone with addiction starts to believe that they need what they need when they need it, because their brain believes that instant gratification is pleasure, right? Which is why most people with addiction have no patience. They don't want to wait for anything. They can't tolerate anything, right? But that's because the brain has been wired such to believe that waiting is not as efficient as not waiting. Needing a pill, a chemical, for everything. This is part of the disease of addiction. This is not about a specific drug. So I have patients all the time that come to me and say, why can't I take trazodone to help me sleep? I haven't been able to sleep for years. You've been using drugs for years, but okay. But I haven't been able to sleep. Why can't I take trazodone? Trazodone is not addictive. And I say, because it's not the trazodone that's the problem. It's your need to take a pill to fix a problem that can be fixed behaviorally with time and effort, right? That's the concern I have. Once you've proven to me that you'll put in the work and do the effort and find a way to sleep using behavioral methods, if you want to talk about a simpler way, like trazodone, we'll have that conversation. But show me that you'll put in the work first, because I'm not going to continue to just allow your brain to seek out what's easy for you, because that's not helpful. In the long run, that's not helpful to anybody, right? So it's never about, because here's the thing, there's only like 11 people on earth that have that disease where you can't sleep and you die. Polyinsomnial familial disease. 11 people, maybe 10 now, I don't know, because you die pretty quickly, and nobody in the US has it. So I know it's not my patients. They're not coming to me, oh, I'm gonna die if I haven't slept. No, you're not, you'll be fine. I haven't slept in 2 weeks. Well, you have, because you're alive. So I'm certain you've slept, right? Not as well, or as refreshingly, or you may feel foggy and all kinds of, I get it, But also, part of the problem is this, instant gratification. I'm so used to changing the way I feel and fixing the problem that when that doesn't happen right away, I assume there's something wrong. There's a better way, right? There must be something quicker, better, faster, smoother, easier. And that's the addicted brain. Seeking out any way to avoid the things that will help. A lot of times what I find myself doing is asking my patients, what do you think you need in order to get well? Like we have inpatient rehab, we have outpatient group, we have individual counseling, we have self-help groups out in the community, 12-step groups, other ones. What do you think will help you? And nine times out of 10, they're like, oh, just some individual counseling. Okay, well that's the thing we're not doing, okay? Because the addicted brain will always seek out the thing that will allow it to stay protected, will allow it to stay where it wants to be, right? Isolated, the fewer people that can see inside and see what's happening, the better, right? People with addiction do not like the idea of anything with groups and other people, and I can't tell you how many of them come into my office truly believing they have some kind of social anxiety that they don't have. Addiction is a disease of isolation. It wants people to be isolated, right? And I would argue that that's the reason we're seeing such a huge number of overdoses over the last year, because we took away so many of the support networks and the in-person groups that people needed in order to stay well, and we forced them to isolate, which was the exact petri dish condition that addiction needed. So this is where I talk briefly about the process addictions, right, which is the behavioral addictions, because somebody always has a question about it. So the behavioral addictions are things like gambling addiction, sex addiction, exercise addictions, pornography addiction, video game addiction, right? So these things really exist, but they are not the same as drug addiction in terms of crossover. So with drug addiction, if you're addicted to alcohol, truly have addiction to alcohol, you are also addicted to methamphetamine, even if you've never used it, because the level of dopamine from those substances is the same for everybody, okay? For process addictions, you have to have a specific gene for that process addiction. Meaning that if I have gambling addiction, I have a gene that says that when I gamble, I release more than normal amounts of dopamine into my system. So, but that doesn't mean that when I exercise too much or watch pornography, I necessarily have that same problem. So there's no crossover with these. What we generally see with the process addictions, though, is that somebody starts with a substance use problem, and they take away their drugs. And we take away their drugs, maybe they're on probation, maybe children's services is involved, maybe their church or their mom's like, don't use drugs, so they're absent. So they're not using anything. Well, what happens is there's a period of time while that threshold is moving back to normal, because abstinence will make the dopamine receptors come back, okay? It's friable, they'll go away with one use of the substance, but they start to come back, right? Well, during the process of those receptors coming back and that threshold moving back down, there's a period of time where every single person with addiction is going to be depressed. They should feel depressed because they cannot experience joy or pleasure from anything normal, right? That nothing that they love doing can produce enough dopamine to cross that threshold, but they're not using substances. So there's a period of time where they should look very depressed, dysthymic, unhappy. What's the point of being clean if I'm gonna feel depressed all the time, right? There's a period of time that happens. For some people who have the genes for process addictions, they will find their process addiction during this time. So they'll start exercising compulsively, or they'll start working all the time, or they will start watching porn or playing video games. And they'll realize, oh, okay, I'm getting a good amount of dopamine from this. And so the threshold stops moving. It stops there, because that's where it keeps getting the spikes of dopamine. So they keep going to the casino, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep getting the same amount of dopamine threshold there. Well, then they run out of money, they get kicked out, they're not allowed to gamble anymore, and so ultimately they wind up running out of money and they can't do it, and so now they can't have any dopamine from anything, and so now they're dysthymic again. But they haven't been building any coping skills, they've been gambling, and so now they go back to using as soon as something stressful happens. So that's kind of the idea here behind process addictions. So basically, addiction is a broken reward center, a stress-induced pleasure deafness that occurs in both the midbrain and the cortex, right? Which results in loss of control, which is violating your core value system, craving, and then persistent use despite negative consequences, right? You gotta have negative consequences in order for it to be a problem. And negative consequences fall into every category: medical, social, financial, right? And I always say to people, if somebody tells you, if somebody you care about comes to you and says, I'm worried about your drinking or use of whatever, and you continue to use that substance, you have just placed the use of a substance over the care and concern of a loved one. I don't see how that's not a problem. Because if a loved one came to me and said, look, I'm honestly in my heart concerned about the amount of cookies you eat, I would at least take an honest look at my cookie consumption, right? Because I don't want that person to be worried about me. Okay, so it's a disease of the brain, midbrain and cortex. The defect is a broken reward system and then decreased skill sets, right? An inability to access appropriate behavioral skill sets in the frontal cortex. And then the symptoms are loss of control, craving, persistent use by negative concepts. Craving you can see in a brain scanner, right? So craving is the symptom similar to the X-ray, right? The broken bone, you can see it on an X-ray, that's the symptom. So there's the physiological symptom, and then the others are really behavioral symptoms. So yeah, it's a disease. It fits into the same model as the other diseases. So the question is, well, then what do we do about it, right? What do we do about it? And I think that, essentially, I think it's important to remember this. Addiction is a chronic disease. So it is on a continuum, okay? And I think of it like, lately I've been thinking of it like a bookshelf, right? And on one end, you have a bookend that's harm reduction, right? And the idea is like to just not die, right? Let's help people just not die. We don't really care about building up the skill sets or growth or any of that. We just want them to not die. That's the harm reduction end. And on the other end, we've got a bookend that's the thrive piece, the prevention piece, right? How are we going to help people in the future not have this problem? And how are we going to help those that are in recovery sort of thrive beyond just not using, right? Because when you've spent like years and years with a loved one who has addiction, just trying to get them to get clean, and then they get clean, our expectations of them are so low. Just don't use, don't go back to using, right? We never set these high bars that we would for other people that don't have addiction, and I think that's really sad. Because I think people in recovery have great potential to achieve great things, but the bar is held so low for them. Just don't use. Okay, well, okay. So in between those two bookends, I think we have the treatment pieces, right? Which is mostly what I do, what places like OneEighty does. Most treatment centers sort of focus on that area because that is the area that's the most inundated, I think. And so what we do is we start with the most acute medical problem first. Obviously, if someone's overdosing or having a stroke or something, we're going to treat that. But then we go to detox. Detox is not treatment. Detox is just a stabilization, getting the drugs out of the system, okay? That's it. That's not treatment. That's getting the drugs out of the system, and remember, the drugs are not the problem. Then we have to quiet the midbrain, right? So that's the first step in real treatment, quiet the midbrain. How do we get the midbrain to stop craving and screaming all the time? And then we restore the cortex. We build up the skill sets, and we help them thrive and have some, higher expectations of themselves, right? So those are the steps really in the bookshelf. And we can move along that continuum for an entire life, and that's okay. That's what chronic disease is, right? We're doing really well, we may slide back, there's nothing wrong with that. And we sort of have this tendency to think like, oh, well, they went to rehab and now they're not using, so they're done. And that's just not the way it works. There's lifelong maintenance in figuring out how to keep these coping skills active and understanding that even an exposure 30 years down the road could cause those receptors to start going away again. So if I'm an alcoholic, if I drank alcohol and it triggered my genes to turn on, and it triggered my dopamine receptors to go away, let's say I drank for 12 years before that happened. So I was able to drink normally, recreationally, socially, for about 12 years, and then after 12 years, I was unable to control it as much, because that's what happens. Well, so now I've triggered that gene, at my 12-year mark or whatever, but then I go and I get clean and I get into recovery and I'm sober and I'm not using and I'm not drinking and I'm utilizing all these skills, and then I kind of get to this point where I'm like, all right, you know what, I've been sober 25 years, I don't need to still go to meetings or talk to my counselor or go to church or do the things that were helping me, because I'm good. It's been 25 years since I've drank. One drink, and those people are back on detox within 6 months. I see it all the time. People with 40 years sober, winding up back in detox after 6 months, right, of drinking, one time. So yeah, it's a continuum, right? So this is the one bookend, right? The first bookend is this harm reduction idea, and there's two kinds of harm reduction, and I'm not going to get on a soapbox about this tonight because there's just not enough time, but I do want to just briefly touch on it. So the first is these strategies and ideas aimed at reducing harm, right? And so these are things about just don't die. Just don't die, right? Let's just not get endocarditis from using dirty needles. Let's not get hepatitis from using dirty needles. Let's not get STDs from sex work to get drugs. Let's keep people safe, right? And people struggle, I think, with the needle exchange, like safe injection sites. No, I wouldn't do that. But we have a harm reduction society. You're allowed to drink alcohol and drive, right? You just have to be below a certain level. But to me, true abstinence would be 0, right? You can't drink anything and drive. But we say, well, there's less harm as long as it's below this. So we're trying to reduce the amount of harm. And then there's the other piece of harm reduction, which is really this movement for more social justice, which is, things like recognizing obstacles to recovery for people, right? Which are things like, poverty, availability of resources, and then, the idea of let's have these conversations within our own, like you all came here because you have an interest. So to be perfectly honest, while there's some of you out there that may be like, I don't know if I buy all this or whatever, that's totally fine because we can have a conversation, right? But there are people out there that aren't here, right? They're not here, and we're never going to convince them. So what has to happen is we have to collectively figure out how to get rid of the stigma. And the way we do that is by we stop judging. We stop deciding what's right and what's wrong, right? Because the people out there are going, using drugs is wrong and it's the choice and blah, blah, blah. The people in here, and I'm not pointing anybody out, but the people in here are the ones going, well, if you're taking a medication, you're not really clean. Well, if you don't do 12 steps, you're not really clean. Well, if, everyone in here has an opinion about what it should and shouldn't be. And what we need to do is collectively agree that if it's not our recovery, we don't get to have an opinion on it. Because I have never, ever in my entire life treated a patient for thyroid disease and had their parents call me and say, how long is my kid going to be on this thyroid medicine? Right? So we start with detox, and only because it's the most life-threatening piece of addiction treatment. So alcohol, benzodiazepines, people die. That's it. They die from withdrawal from alcohol and benzos. Benzos, again, they're basically freeze-dried alcohol. So they need to be in a hospital setting. They need to be taken off carefully under medical care. Opiates don't kill anyone in withdrawal, but people die because they can't tolerate any pain or discomfort, and they wind up going out and using and overdosing and dying. There is no actual detox for methamphetamine, cocaine, marijuana, okay? It's uncomfortable, unpleasant, because emotionally there's a lot of anxiety and restlessness, but they'll live. So the division of labor for treatment basically comes down to quieting the midbrain and then building up the cortex. And that's it. That's it. Quieting the midbrain, well, the main goal is to restore the cortex, right? That's the end of the treatment spectrum. It's like, let's build up these coping skills so that no matter what happens, you don't have to go back to using. And let's practice those skills so much that when something terrible happens, you're so used to picking up the phone or doing whatever self-care that you've come to appreciate as your coping skills is second nature. So you don't reach out and use. That's the ultimate goal of treatment. So basically building up the cortex involves building up the skill sets, okay? And there's two things that we kind of look at. And the idea is coping skills, stress relief, dealing with barriers, socioeconomic barriers, developing a sense of self, right? But finding a sense of purpose. That's really the key. The key to treating addiction is finding a purpose, because nothing will stimulate the cortex to build new skills and practice those skills than the sense and feeling of purpose and personal growth. And the reason that punishment doesn't work is because punishment very seldom focuses on cortex building, right? Put somebody in jail for 5 years. They can be abstinent. We all know they don't have to be, but if they choose to be abstinent in jail for 5 years, they get out, their midbrain's back to normal. They have a normal amount of receptors, so it's not a craving issue, right? But then what happens is they get out, a month later something stressful happens, and they have no new coping skill. And the brain immediately reaches for the coping skill to remember to be efficient, accessible, and quick. And it goes to use. They use. And they wind up relapsing. You're like, you just spent 5 years in jail for that drug. Right? So that's why it doesn't work. So the tasks of treating addiction are providing coping skills, stress relief, safe environment, and social supports. So that's it. That's how we treat addiction. Provide coping skills and the ability to practice those skills. Stress relief skills and the ability to practice those skills. Help provide a safe environment, right? Avoid people, places, and things. And then social supports, and not just family members. Because if your family members were enough to keep you from using, you wouldn't be using in the first place. Spiritual growth, personal development, purpose. That's all I'm talking about. When I talk about spiritual growth and personal development, all I'm talking about is your purpose in life. So whatever that looks like. So basically, to build up the cortex, we use things like counseling, right? People want to do individual counseling all the time because they think that's the solution. If I could just get to the reason why I'm an addict, I think I can fix it. And I always say, you don't have to know how to eat a donut, or how to make a donut to eat a donut, right? You don't. You have to know how to fix it before you can look at the why. Because if you have no coping skills to deal with the trauma you're going to dig up in counseling, you're going to wind up using over and over and over, right? Counseling is great, very important, but it's not going to treat the addiction. Group counseling, however, will, right? And I always say the reason is because an individual counselor, no matter how skilled they are, can be out-manipulated by an actively using addict. But a group of other addicts cannot be out-manipulated by an actively using addict. It's not possible, right? So the group counseling is really important for holding up those mirrors. Like, this is what you're doing, and I know you're doing it because I do it too, right? 12-step, we are a 12-step based agency, but ultimately I just endorse any kind of spiritual growth in whatever capacity. In my opinion, the 12-step program is the simplest way to get there because it gives you literally 12 steps, like a recipe for making cake. Here are your 12 steps. At the end, you'll have spiritual growth and you will have found some purpose in your life. Here you go. Or you can go some convoluted way and try and figure it out. It's up to you. Either way is okay, right? And then thrive. And then the midbrain, the goals are abstinence, right? Or a steady state of dopamine. So the reason we use medication-assisted treatment, and we only have medication for opiates and alcohol, right? But the only reason we use them is because they can create a steady state of dopamine in the brain or mimic abstinence in the brain so that those receptors have time to come back down to normal. That level, that threshold can come back down to normal so that that period of dysthymia, the person is able to focus on finding purpose, building skills, developing stress relief, etc. Right? Because sometimes for some people that's too hard to do during that initial period of abstinence. So over time with abstinence or with medication, the threshold will turn to normal. It is a friable system though. So remember, it took 12 years for me to get there in the first place, but now it only takes one drink 10 years later to get there again. And I've never been like a huge proponent that like a chemical is the treatment for chemical dependency unless your goal is harm reduction, right? That a chemical can be used in and of by itself. But that's not the goal of treatment centers. The goal of treatment centers is to help people develop those coping skills to find purpose and a sense of personal growth in life. So I think I'm probably going to skip through most of these so we can get to the, so marijuana, THC, not CBD, THC, releases an abnormally high amount of dopamine in the reward center in the cortex. The dopamine released from marijuana is the same dopamine released from heroin, methamphetamine, and alcohol and all of that. So for people who have addiction, continued use of marijuana puts you in a position of potential relapse in the high 80 to 90% range, right? Because the brain is continually using that high-level dopamine to cope with life. So it's not going to learn new skills, right? Why would it? It has a great skill at home, sitting on the shelf in the bomb or whatever you're using, the gummies, right? So if you're not an addict, if you don't have addiction, and you're given a choice between starting on OxyContin for your pain or starting on marijuana for your pain, please take the marijuana, absolutely. You're talking about a 9% chance of addiction with marijuana versus the 20% chance of addiction with opiates. Okay? So there is a big difference. Xanax for anxiety versus marijuana for anxiety, please take the marijuana. This is the same thing. Very high potential for addiction with the Xanax, 9% only with the marijuana. And the reason that addiction is a family disease is not because the person with addiction steals from you and lies to you and does all these horrible things. It is because as family members, we fixate on our addicts the way that they fixate on drugs and they become our drug of choice. We have addiction to them. Codependency, a lot of people don't like that term. I don't know what else to call it, but essentially that's what it is. So it's not normal to live your life worrying about, like, is my debit card in my pillowcase where my person with addiction can't get it? Is my car keys safe so they can't have another car accident or whatever? Like, that's not a normal way to live. And so people need to, the family members need to start focusing on how do I take care of myself, right? How do I get to a place where I'm healthy so that A, I'm setting a good example, and B, that I'm prepared for whatever comes out of this addiction. Right? Because we cannot make somebody else get well. We cannot love them well. And ultimately, prevention is the key. We need to prevent it. I don't know how we do that because it's an adolescent disease. It starts in adolescence for most people. I don't even like adolescence. I'm dreading when my child is an adolescent. But I think probably taking some of the we give adults in recovery and maybe making them age appropriate and teaching them right from the very beginning to children will at least pave some of those paths, right? So at least we'll be giving them some roads in the frontal cortex, so that if they do wind up using or experiencing addiction, they have something to fall back on, instead of having to create all new pathways to begin with. So with that, I'm going to shut up. This would be my page of, references if I cared to refer. So, questions? I can take some questions. All of this is in my book, plus, all of this plus is in my book. That's the reason I wrote the book. It is a lot of material, yeah. It is a lot, and it was a very lot to condense into an hour. Hour and a half. Still hard, but yes, it's all in the book. Also, this lecture plus every other version of it is available on social media, YouTube, somewhere, so you could watch it and pause it. So the question is, why do you give drugs to a drug addict to treat the drug addiction, right? And so in the instance of opiate addiction, for example, right? So somebody's addicted to opiates, heroin, oxycodone, whatever. Their threshold for pleasure is really high, just like any other drug, right? And they're receptive. However, opiate addiction creates a very specific, unique event in individuals where people who are addicted specifically to opiates are unable to tolerate discomfort to a degree that you don't see with the other substances. And so their inability to tolerate that discomfort puts them in a position where you can send them to a 12-step meeting and say, sit down, shut up, listen, get a sponsor, do all that work through the steps, and they can't even get past that place in their head where they're like, I gotta feel different. And so providing them with a medication to sort of quiet that enough, right, so that they're able to hear some stuff, that's why it works, right, so that they can learn some skills. And the goal behind them, and so even your methadone, your Vivitrol, or naltrexone, your buprenorphine, or Suboxone, right, the purpose behind them is to take them once a day, or once a month, but once a day, and that's it, right? Because we need to eliminate as many of the behaviors as possible. So anybody who's taking like Suboxone like 3 times a day, nope, that's not gonna help addiction. No, that's not how it was meant to be taken. It's a 36-hour medication. It creates a bell curve. So it should be taken once every morning, same time, or every night, same time, doesn't matter. And that's it. Because we're eliminating that, I don't feel right, I don't feel good, I don't feel comfortable, I need to take something, right? Because that's addiction, that's active addiction, even though that medication is prescribed. That's why the methadone clinics were designed, as annoying as it is, to be, daily dosing in the morning once, that's it. Because we're trying to eliminate behaviors, right? But for opiate addiction specifically, it's very, very hard to take. Not only that, but I always explain to people that, like, while every drug is the same, a drug is a drug is a drug, crack cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, they're like the Maseratis and the Ferraris on the way to like the hell of addiction, but alcohol is like the Schwinn bicycle, right? So they're all going the same place, but some are faster and some are slower, right? So that puts people in this kind of unique position where people who have alcohol as the main drug of choice, right? By the time they're in a place where they want to get well, where their life is a disaster, they're like, I've lost so much, I'm ready to get sober, they're very willing to do whatever it takes to make their life better. So they're going to do uncomfortable things. They're going to take bad advice. They're going to do things they don't want to do. Because they're older in life, they have more experience with life, they have lost more, they have a sense of desperation. Whereas opiates, because they so quickly take people down and out, we're dealing with a much younger population who don't know what desperation is. They haven't lost a career and a spouse, and many of them, they've lost their children, but they have this belief, I'll get them back, I'll do what I have, right? They haven't lost everything that they've worked really hard for in life to get to that place where, you know what, I'll do whatever you say. And that's not, it's a generalization, I'm not saying that's true for all people who use opiates or whatever, but just kind of a trend that we see is that a younger population is much harder to sort of rein in to like do these behavioral things because they don't feel comfortable and they don't know how to make themselves feel uncomfortable. So would I consider using Vivitrol in alcoholism or somebody who's using alcohol without the other elements of treatment? So if the idea is harm reduction, fine. I've not ever seen that really be that successful because Vivitrol for alcohol just reduces cravings in a certain percentage of the population, right? And again, if I'm talking about the harm reduction bookend, fine, that's one thing. But in a treatment element, that if the idea is to help someone get well, well, if they need Vivitrol because they're drinking alcohol, they're actively drinking alcohol, which means they don't have the coping skills, they don't have the stress relief skills. So providing them this medication that decreases their cravings is irrelevant because something's going to happen stressful in their life that they won't know how to handle and they're going to drink. Right? So do they necessarily need residential? No, I think that they need an assessment. So we always have people assessed by a counselor to say, based on your circumstances, this is the level of care that I think would be the least intensive. We always try to do the least intensive level of care for the individual that we think would be beneficial. And then if that doesn't work, you kind of refer up the ladder or down the bookshelf or whatever. So I think that medication in and of itself can be beneficial to reduce harms. Yeah.
My son's having some more of those drugs. He doesn't seem to have a drug of choice or anything except for not pretty much taking alcohol. He had no preference. Well, you know, they can do it.
Yes. Yes. So nobody needs to have a drug of choice, and that's the point, is they're all exactly the same. The brain doesn't know the difference. Now, some people preferentially, because of genetics, get more dopamine from heroin or crack or whatever, and that's why it's their drug of choice. But for people in rehabs, they call themselves garbage heads or polysubstance users, the correct term or whatever. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter. A drug's a drug. So the treatment is the same. You got to treat the disease, not the specific drug. So Suboxone, is that something that an opiate addict would maybe need to take for the rest of their life? And my answer is, yes, it's possible. It's an individual, so again, when you're treating people in medicine, you're treating individuals, right? So we're treating the disease, but in each individual. So I always say there are people who break their leg who are on crutches for a few weeks, and then they get better, and they go to, whatever, they go to physical therapy, they do all the things, and they get better, and they get off crutches. But there are some people who break their leg, go to physical therapy, do all the things, and they still wind up with gangrene, and they have to have their leg removed, and they're on crutches for the rest of their life, right? So there are people who use opiates who it is appropriate, based on their history, for them to be on a replacement medication for the majority of their life. For others, no, not so much. So it should be taken individually. In my opinion, there are too many providers out there that just throw it at everybody that walks in the door and just said, you're going to be on this for life. I don't agree with that. I think taking it case by case matters. Well, that would be harm reduction. So if you come into a harm reduction clinic, but the thing is, those people are not going back there over and over for the rest of their life. They wind up using other things, overdosing, dying, right? So if you're in a harm reduction program and you're walking into a harm reduction clinic to get Suboxone just to prevent you from overdosing, and you're not in any kind of treatment, that person is not going there for life. It's just not happening, right? Because their life will take them out sooner. But if they're in a treatment program, right? So in my mind, there's MAT, medication as treatment, and there's MAT, medication assisted treatment. Right? So medication as treatment would be a harm reduction strategy, and medication assisted treatment is medication that assists treatment, right? And that's what I do. Yes.
Yes. In some of let's go on the medication that is Suboxone. And you mentioned that drug was the
So the question is, if they continue to use a medication like buprenorphine or methadone and they're at a steady state of dopamine, will the dopamine receptors return and the threshold come back to normal? And the answer is yes, because it is the spiking of dopamine that causes the receptors to go away. So it is the spikes of dopamine. When someone takes buprenorphine or methadone, what happens is initially they get probably a little bit more than a normal amount of dopamine, but as they continue to take it on a daily basis, that threshold or that level of dopamine comes down, and it comes down to a steady state at a natural place. Yeah. Yes. So how do you get your loved one who has no coping skills and who has clearly suffered lots of consequences from their use understand that they need to do some work in order to get well? And the answer is, I'm sorry to say that you can't. There's no way to make somebody else know that they need to do something. They have to arrive at that conclusion, right? And so the way most people arrive at that conclusion is by continuing to have consequences and saying, okay, enough is enough, and I'm able to say that these losses in my life are directly attributable to my use, and it's not worth it to me to continue to lose things like this. So I want to do the work, and I'll go and I'll do what I have to do. But we don't get to decide what that is, right? So while I think there's some value to the idea of tough love or whatever, like, not enabling, I also don't think that you're not going to force anybody's hand, which I think is what people think, right? So you can't, there's no way to do that. It's simply, you can continue. So I always encourage family members to set a good example, right? So family members should be going to some kind of therapy for themselves if they're dealing with a loved one that's really emotionally trying. Also, there's self-help groups like 12-step groups for family members, Al-Anon, right? Nar-Anon. Those are not teaching you how to convince your person to get well. They're about teaching you how to get well. So you're setting a good example, but you're also putting yourself in a position to deal with the consequences of whatever their choices are, right? You cannot make somebody see what you see. You cannot make them feel what you feel. It is not possible. So you love them as much as you can, and you be there as much as you can with your own boundaries, right? You set up your boundaries to keep yourself safe. You pray for them or whatever you believe, and you allow them to fall on their faces until they get to the point where they're sick of living their life, But people die from addiction, yes. I'll be honest, I know lots of people that have, loved ones that have diabetes, that refuse to take their insulin or refuse to check their blood sugars or refuse to stop eating cookies and cake all the time, right? It's just as painful to see because they're gonna die, right? But nothing that you do is gonna stop them from sneaking the Oreos, and keeping them in their closet or whatever. There's nothing you can do because they know. They just have to be at that point where they're ready to stop or whatever before they're gonna make any choices. Some families do choose to sort of say, I'm done with you until you stop, hoping that by losing, you as a family member, that they'll say, okay, I'm ready, I've lost enough. But that doesn't always work either. Yes? Hmm? You handle it exactly the way you're handling that. You set up a boundary for yourself and you uphold that boundary, whatever it is. That's it, right? I can't have it in my house, so it's not gonna be in my house, that's that, right? Right, that's okay, that's appropriate to do. If your loved one was repeatedly punching your dog in the face, and you said, I can't have this in my house, I know, you're gonna hurt my dog. I don't know if anybody loves dogs like I do, but, out you go, son, right? Just can't have it in my house.